He had witnessed hundreds of life or death moments. But only once, only that time, did something inside him truly unravel. It was when he saw it, a wild Mustang, crumpled between life and death. The world fell silent, like it was holding its breath, waiting for him to make a choice that couldn't be undone. The horse knelt in the snow-covered forest, its body soaked in blood, breathing like death itself was knocking on its chest. He could have walked away. And maybe he should have. But that look, that one look in the horse's eyes. It was the same look from his past, from a place where mistakes still begged for forgiveness. And it held him there, frozen in time. Right then, beneath the soul-cutting white of winter. A man who had long lost himself stepped into a battle no one asked him to fight. Not for glory. Not for praise. But because he couldn't walk away, not again. You think it was just a horse? No. It was a calling. From nature. From memory. From the very piece of his humanity he thought he had left behind in the winters of his past. One look. One choice. And the history of two souls, a man and a horse, was rewritten in snow and blood. Join me to uncover the truth no one ever dared to tell. The first time he saw it, it was breathing in shallow gasps, as if preparing to die. The ground was white as parchment, so clean it felt sterile. Fresh snow from the night before had erased every trace of the world, transforming the forest into a frozen, voiceless painting. Overhead, the pale morning sun struggled to pierce through layers of fog, scattering faint golden threads like unraveling silk across a sky the color of old ash. Jonas Harlow stood on the porch of the small log cabin he had called home for the past 3 years, ever since he left the city, abandoning a once glorious past laced with bitterness. In his hands was a clay mug, still warm with freshly brewed coffee, though his mind was colder than anything the mountain could offer. In the silence, Ember, his wolf dog with amber eyes, shifted under the awning, sniffing the wind as if she had caught something invisible. She raised her head slowly, ears standing erect, the fur along her spine bristling. No bark. Just a low growl, then a long, unblinking stare at Jonas, as if signaling something beyond words. Jonas narrowed his eyes. Ember had once saved him from a snowslide during his first winter here. She didn't sound the alarm unless it mattered. He set the mug down on the railing, pulled on his coat, gloves, and slipped a folding knife into the chest pocket. The cold hit him like a slap as he followed Ember into the woods, the forest he thought he had memorized, tree by tree. But today, something felt wrong. The wind carried a faint metallic scent, just a hint, but unmistakable. A few snapped branches. Drag marks in the snow. A tight knot formed in his chest. Nearly half a mile in, Ember stopped. Below them, in a shallow snow-covered valley, lay a dark, formless mass. Jonas quickened his pace, then froze. It was a horse. A wild horse. It lay on its side, curled in on itself, legs trembling as if caught in the grips of a seizure. The snow around its body was blotched with dark, drying blood. A deep wound on its hind leg pulsed red and swollen, torn open as if by claws. Its coat was jet black, with a strange violet sheen in the light, but now it was matted with mud, frozen dirt, and blood. Each breath it drew was a fight, stretching the seconds between life and death. Jonas felt his chest seize. He didn't move. Time hardened around him like ice, as if he had stepped into a moment that didn't belong to this world. He had sworn he would never touch another horse again. And now, here it was. A dying creature lying at his feet, like a crack tearing open the curse he had placed on himself. A gust of wind howled through the trees, whipping up a dusting of snow from the horse's body, revealing more wounds along its ribs, long, deep gashes. Predator marks. Jonas scanned the area, no human footprints. No rope. No tire tracks. This horse was wild, no question. And it had come here alone, before collapsing. He moved slowly, eventually kneeling beside it. His hand trembled as he reached out and touched the dense, freezing fur. The horse flinched, ears twitching. Its eyes cracked open, deep black, filled with weariness, pain, and fear. And then, something strange happened. It didn't flee. Didn't try to rise. It just lay there, as if its body had nothing left to fight with, or maybe it was waiting to see what he would do. Jonas shrugged off his coat and gently draped it over the horse's body. He pressed his hand to its chest, feeling a fragile heartbeat thrum beneath the skin, like a torn drum someone was still trying to beat. Its breath was heavy, wheezing. A long exhale escaped from Jonas's own lungs. He remembered the last time he felt a heartbeat like this, Orion's final breath, and the sterile silence of the euthanasia room, when the needle hissed and no one asked for his permission. Jonas tilted his head back, bracing his hand on his knee, and stared into the depths of the forest. Snow had started falling again. He knew he didn't have much time. No phone signal. No help. The horse wouldn't survive the night, not like this. He dug into his pocket, pulled out the folding knife, and made his way to a nearby stream. There, on the icy bank, he found what he needed: bundles of dry grass. The only material that could serve as makeshift cold compresses. He dipped them in the freezing water and returned. Ember whined softly beside him, part encouragement, part warning. He pressed the wet bundles to the horse's leg. It jerked, but didn't kick. Its eyes widened, not with trust, but surrender. And yet, within them shimmered a trace, just a trace, of hope. He tucked the coat tighter, tore a strip of cloth from his scarf, and wrapped it around the bleeding area. Then he sat. In silence. Beside a creature without a name. In a forest where time had forgotten to move forward. The sky darkened. The forest shadows stretched long across the snow. The ground grew colder by the minute. Ember nestled close against Jonas's side, shivering slightly. And Jonas began to whisper. "You know, I used to have a horse. His name was Orion. Beautiful as a dream. Ran like a storm. I used to think we were unbeatable." His voice cracked. He hadn't meant to speak. But here, in the relentless cold, next to a dying animal, surrounded by the solemn hush of the trees, there was nothing left but memory. They said he couldn't be saved. No one asked me. They just did it. I couldn't stop them. And from that day on, I swore I'd never get close to another horse again. But now you're here. He trailed off. Ember stirred. The wind howled through the trees in reply. Jonas stood slowly. His legs were numb, but his heart was warming. He looked down at the horse. It was still breathing. And as long as it was breathing, he had to do something. "You're not dying today," he murmured. "Not while I'm here." He looked up at the sky. The clouds had turned a dull gray, the kind that announced an incoming storm. If he wanted to save it, he'd have to get it back to the cabin. Now. Before the storm came. And in that skin-cutting cold, a decision was made, not by logic, but by some primal instinct he thought had died years ago. Jonas turned to Ember. "We're bringing it home. Even if we have to drag a boulder through the snow." Ember looked at him and nodded. And so, an old vow was broken, not with words, but with action. With a man's quiet resolve to bring a fading soul back to firelight. Back to life. No one else would know it, but that night, beneath the trees and falling snow, a legend had just begun. He could have walked away, and no one would have blamed him. But he knew, if he did, he'd never be himself again. Jonas knelt beside the horse. On one side, snow was falling thick and fast, the cold slicing through his clothes like blades. On the other lay Shadowlight, a dark, trembling body, breathing in shallow, ragged gasps, as if each one were a farewell. The pine forest around them had fallen eerily silent, as if nature itself was watching his decision. He could walk away. No one would ever know. No one would hold it against him. But he would know. He knew that feeling, that final look before the light fades. The gaze of a creature that had placed its trust in a human, only to be left behind. Orion had looked at him that way. That night sky, the day they led his beloved horse into the euthanasia room, was etched into his memory. Orion hadn't cried out. He just stood there, his eyes still and calm like the surface of a lake. And as the needle entered his vein, he never broke eye contact. No blame. No anger. Just a question. Silent. Why didn't you do something? Jonas had lived with that question for 5 years. He pressed both hands onto the coat covering Shadowlight's body, trying to shield it from the biting wind. His eyes moved across its injuries. The hind leg had a deep gash, blood thick but still seeping. Its side bore long claw marks, torn deep through the fur. A bear? A mountain goat? Or worse? He tore his scarf into 3 strips, folded them tightly, and pressed them against the leg wound. With no antiseptic, he scooped up clean snow and applied it gently to help stop the bleeding. His fingers were numb, but he held the pressure steady. "Don't die on me," he murmured, maybe to Shadowlight, maybe to himself. Ember approached, sitting close to Jonas. Her eyes fixed on the forest behind them. Something was out there, hiding in the wind. Jonas leaned down, pressed his ear to the horse's chest. Still beating. Faint. Uneven. But alive. There was no signal. No one knew they were out here. From here to the cabin was nearly 3 miles of forest trail. Even on a clear day, it was a grueling trek. Today, with fresh snow, an approaching storm, and a horse that couldn't walk, it felt impossible. Jonas inhaled deeply. Dozens of scenarios ran through his mind, and he dismissed them all. Leave the horse, go back for the truck. Too far. It wouldn't survive. Stay here overnight? No tent. No blankets. The storm would freeze them both before sunrise. Only one choice remained: drag it home. He looked around and spotted it. A fallen tree trunk. Long enough. Wide enough. Smooth bark. Flat base. If he could turn it into a sled. Jonas stood, drew his knife, and ran to the trunk. He stripped away the excess branches, tested its sturdiness. One end was rotted. He cut it off. Then he patted snow beneath the base, shaping it into a rough sled. Returning to Shadowlight, he gently lifted each leg onto the trunk. The horse whimpered each time, muscles flinching. Ember circled them, growling softly. She never left Jonas' side, as if she too sensed how thin the thread of life had become. After nearly 40 minutes of effort, Jonas had Shadowlight secured to the makeshift sled, held by belts, shirt sleeves, and an old tent rope from 3 winters ago. It wasn't perfect. But it was enough. He exhaled hard, grabbed the rope, and looked ahead into the snow-laced woods. Let's go. Before things get worse. When conscience speaks, the body obeys, even if it means dragging a soul through a frozen hell. Jonas wrapped the crude rope around his shoulders and waist. He lowered his body, braced through his legs, and began to pull. The sled let out a deep groan, then shifted just a few inches. Every step was torment. The snow collapsed beneath him, forcing him to stomp out a new path, one wide enough for both him and the sled. Ember pushed ahead, digging into the snow with her paws like a living plow. Within 10 minutes, sweat was streaming down Jonas' face. His undershirt clung to his back like a second skin. Every time he gained momentum, the sled would catch on a root or mound. He had to stop, kneel, dig the snow away with frozen hands, then press forward again. Shadowlight was silent now. Its head drooped. Breathing slow, labored. The quiet wasn't comforting, it was the body giving up. Jonas glanced at his watch. 3:57 p.m. Nightfall was closing in. And so was the storm. As his legs trembled, Jonas remembered Orion. It had snowed that day, too, not forest snow, but city slush outside the stable. He had sprinted there after the call. Orion's leg had snapped. But by the time he arrived, they had already administered the injection. He hadn't screamed. Hadn't shed a tear. Just stood, holding a broken bridle, eyes empty. They thought he'd accepted it. They were wrong. He had shattered deep inside. And he never cried. Because if he cried, he would fall apart completely. Now, with each footfall into the snow, he whispered in his mind, "I didn't save you, Orion. But this time will be different." The wind shifted. Ember stopped in her tracks. Her ears perked sharply, growling toward the left side of the woods. Jonas stopped too, instinctively. No distinct sound, but the forest had gone too still. No birds. No wind sifting through branches. Just a weight, heavy and unseen, watching. He crouched, pressed a hand to Shadowlight. Its breath was still there, barely. The other hand gripped the folding knife. No gun. No flares. If something came out of those trees, they had no chance. Ember backed up toward Jonas, fur bristling. She stood between him and the dark, like a soldier who knew what was coming. Jonas lowered his body, whispering, "Don't panic. Keep going. You can't stop now." They reached a gentle slope, leading to a frozen stream. Snow blanketed the surface, hiding whether it was thin ice or solid ground. Jonas stepped first, testing every footfall. The snow crackled lightly, a sound that slammed into his chest. He turned back to the sled, Shadowlight waiting. One wrong move, and the horse would plunge into icy water, a death no one could save it from. He gathered pine branches, laying them side by side, crafting a rough bridge. Then he tugged the rope, guiding Shadowlight slowly across the ice. Ember leapt across first, standing ready on the far side to catch the sled if it slipped. As the black mass slid past him, Jonas held his breath. Not out of fear, but because he knew, if this failed, there would be no second chance. The sled crossed. Slowly. Safely. No cracks. No sink. Only when the full weight was on the other side did Jonas allow himself to collapse, hands on his knees, gasping like a man who had just crossed death's threshold. When life is reduced to a single fragile heartbeat, survival isn't a choice, it's a battle. Jonas had just gotten to his feet when Ember growled again, this time with force. From the left, between two thick trunks, a shadow moved. Slowly. Deliberately. Then stopped. Jonas froze. Eyes squinting to adjust to the dim light. The wind shifted again. And there it was. A mountain goat, or something like it. Large. Fur raised. Eyes glowing amber. It stood tall, ribs sharp beneath its winter coat, shoulders hunched like it carried hunger and something more. It didn't snarl. Didn't charge. It simply stood there, silent, calculating. Are you a threat or a gift? Ember placed herself between Jonas and the sled, low growls rumbling in her throat. Jonas stepped back, slowly pulling the folding knife from his jacket. The blade was dull, worn down. Not a weapon, just a symbol. A refusal to surrender. He inhaled cold air like ice through his lungs. "Go," he said. "We're not your prize tonight." The creature tilted its head. A slow nod, then disappeared behind the trees. No footsteps. No branches cracked. It came like a ghost and vanished like one. Jonas dropped to his knees. His wrists shook violently. But Ember remained on guard, still growling. She knew it wasn't over. That thing might come back. Half a mile left. Jonas tightened the rope, leaned forward, and pulled. His body felt shredded, nerves frayed, breath burning. Vision blurred. Spine screaming. Every step was war. The wind was no longer cold, it was pain. Shadowlight twitched, a spasming response of a body nearing shutdown. Jonas heard a low sob building in his throat, but swallowed it whole. No breaking down. Not now. He pulled. Ember moved behind the sled, pushing with her shoulder every time Jonas stumbled. They were no longer man, dog, and horse, but a single machine made of grit and love. And then, when it felt like everything might collapse, golden light appeared through the trees. The cabin. Faint, smeared by snow on the windows. But to Jonas, it was brighter than any star. He screamed. "We made it! Ember! We're home!" Ember barked back, as if she couldn't believe it either. Jonas dragged the sled to the old stable, where he once kept Orion. Now filled with fresh hay, and a heat lamp still flickering. He opened the door, undid the straps, and pulled Shadowlight inside. The horse collapsed onto the hay, eyes closed, but chest still rising. Jonas fell back on the cold floor, breathing ragged, body trembling. But he smiled. The first real smile in years, without bitterness. Just release. Ember lay beside Shadowlight. Jonas covered the horse with a thick blanket. Checked the wound whose blood had stopped. The bandages were dirty, but the cut hadn't deepened. Something in him settled, like catching a soul that had been falling for too long. He didn't sleep. Just sat there, back against the wall, staring out toward the far trees, where a golden-eyed shadow might still be watching. But he wasn't afraid anymore. Because he hadn't walked away. And on that coldest winter night, between howling winds and hopeless snow, a broken man had remembered how to stand. Not with his legs, but with a soul that had learned, to save another life is sometimes to save your own. When life hangs by a thread, we no longer walk with our feet, but with instinct to protect something greater than ourselves. The wind howled through the old pines, carrying the damp scent of snow and the faint breath of the forest. Jonas tightened the makeshift rope, stitched together from belts, scraps of an old coat, and bits of fabric he never thought he'd use again. Shadowlight lay motionless on the improvised sled, a fallen tree stripped of branches, padded with shirts, dry grass, and snow to insulate and soften the ride. The horse's legs still twitched, its eyelids half closed, breath barely visible like smoke fading in the freezing air. Ember trotted ahead, always keeping a few meters distance, ears perked, nose twitching constantly. For the past 30 minutes, she'd growled at least 4 times, not violently, but enough to let Jonas know they were not alone. "Just because you can't see it, doesn't mean it's not there," he muttered. That was something his father used to say. A quiet man, sharp as an old wolf. Jonas gave a hard pull. The sled groaned forward. Snow hissed under the weight of horse, wood, and sheer will. Every time he fell, he planted his palms, pushed himself up. Every drop of blood from his palms into the snow was swallowed without sound. He didn't scream. He didn't speak. They reached the first slope, not high, but steep enough to punish man and beast. Jonas gasped for air, eyes stinging red from the slapping wind. He nailed 2 dry branches as brake stakes under the sled to slow it down. Pulling uphill, he leaned with his back and knees deep into the snow. Ember dug a path ahead, then came back to push from behind. Then the rope slipped. The sled slid back half a meter. Jonas yelled, jerking it backward, throwing himself onto the snow. Ember barked sharply. No one fell. But both were panting, trembling. He pressed his ear to Shadowlight's chest. Still breathing. Don't give up. I'm not done yet. Behind them, the forest was unnaturally quiet. Not peaceful, watchful. Near the ridge's crest, Ember halted. She sniffed a patch of shallow snow. Jonas followed. Tracks faint, but fresh. Not human. Not wolf. Larger. Wider. Clawed. Maybe a male mountain goat or a young grizzly. Jonas bit his lip. He had no weapon but a folding knife. All he had now was the will not to be consumed by fear creeping up his spine. He crouched, grabbed a sharp branch, tied a scrap of cloth to its tip. Lit it with his last match. Even the faintest light can push back death, he murmured. Ember pressed close to the sled, eyes locked on the tree lean. Shadowlight groaned faintly, as if sensing something was drawing near. Jonas stared at the expanse ahead, a hollow between 2 ridges. Flat, treeless, stoneless. Just snow. Blinding white, thick as half a meter deep. Wind from both sides funneled into this bowl, forming a freezing vortex that bit into his lungs. No tracks. No trail. A blank canvas. We'll have to swim through the snow, Jonas muttered to Ember. No other way. He carved a path with a stick toward the far edge, where a few dead shrubs stood as resting spots. Then he secured more rope around Shadowlight's body to steady the sled. Step by step, he waded forward, his legs sinking to the knees. Snow wasn't soft. Every step dragged him down. The sled sank too. Jonas had to pull, lift, and brace with all his back. Ember pressed forward, no barking now. Just heavy breathing. Her paws soaked in slushy snow. Halfway across, Jonas collapsed face first. Snow flooded his collar, sleeves, and chest like icy stones. He gasped, coughed, eyes blurred with tears and cold. Get up, he growled. Not for yourself, for it. And he stood. Not by strength. By heart. Nearing the other side, Ember suddenly cried out. Not loud, but sharp enough to freeze Jonas mid-step. Her front right leg was bleeding. Maybe from ice shards or a sharp hidden branch. Red drops stained the snow like rubies. No, not you too, Jonas mumbled, kneeling. He tore inner cloth from his coat, wrapped it around her leg. She whined softly, but stayed upright. Still watching the woods, eyes narrowed, ears flat, tail lowered. Jonas knew. Something was close. Not a hunch anymore. He turned to look at the sled's trail, one long, curved drag mark like a bleeding artery. At its end, about 60 meters back, stood a shape. Still. No clear form. Just a dark mass in the snowy mist. Jonas tightened his grip on the knife. Ember growled one last time, then placed herself between him and the shadow. Jonas flicked his lighter, it lit on the 17th try. Wind tried to snuff it immediately. He shielded it with frozen hands, gathered dry twigs, and built a tiny nest. He soaked a cloth with fluid from a mini fire extinguisher in his kit. Flame caught, small, but alive. He stepped back. The shadow didn't move closer. Didn't retreat either. Just watched. As if deciding whether to strike. Or whether Jonas was worthy to protect the creature fate had chosen. Jonas didn't blink. didn't turn. Fire burned. Wind howled. Snow clung to his face. But his eyes stayed open, unflinching. A man with no weapons, a dying horse, an injured dog, and a tiny fire. But he had will. And that made the shadow hesitate. The fire kept burning, flickering but real. The shadow didn't advance, but it didn't vanish either. Jonas leaned back against the sled, holding Ember, whose eyes drooped from blood loss, still facing the dark. Shadowlight barely moved, but his chest still rose, slow and steady. An hour passed. Wind shifted. The shadow melted away. No sound. No trace. Just a ripple in the air, and it was gone. Jonas didn't smile. He knew it only passed them by because they barely counted as prey. Go, he whispered to himself. As long as there's fire, there's a way. He stamped out the flame, retied the rope, ripped more cloth to wrap Ember's paw, and pulled. This time, no one spoke. No moans. No sound but the steady drag of rope. They approached what Jonas called the stone drift, a short slope, dangerously slick from compressed snow and swirling wind. He knew he couldn't just pull Shadowlight down, one slip, and they'd tumble into the ravine. He double-bound the sled, creating a braking line. Ember was tied to a tree to act as a counter-anchor. Jonas held the sled, inching it down. Step by step, snow shifted under his boots. Branches cracked. Shadowlight, unconscious, still groaned faintly, as if his body sensed the edge. One section. Two sections. Mid-slope, the brake snapped. The sled shot down like a bullet. Jonas screamed, ran after it. He threw himself sideways, slammed into the sled. Ember chased behind. All three crashed into a snowbank and lay still. No one was hurt. Silence, and then a long, ragged exhale from Shadowlight. The horse stirred, raised his head slightly. Eyes half open. "You're awake?" Jonas whispered. No reply. But he knew that soul hadn't given up. Ahead, the forest glowed warmer. An old campsite where Jonas had once left a backup tent and supplies. Buried under snow, but still there. Ember gave a soft bark for the first time in hours. Not alarm. Relief. Jonas dragged the sled between two trees, rebuilt the frame of the tent. Inside, a half-full oil lamp. Dried food, thermal blankets, emergency hay, once useless, now miraculous. He spread hay. Laid Shadowlight down. Covered him with thick cloth. Ember curled nearby, wheezing, but alert. Jonas lit the fire again. This time it roared, not just from dry wood, but from resolve never to watch something die again without trying. He sat beside the horse. Gently placed a hand on Shadowlight's forehead. "We're not at the end. But I swear, we're closer than we've ever been." He leaned forward, resting his head on the blood-stained shoulder, and for the first time in years, closed his eyes to sleep. Not from exhaustion, but because now he knew he was no longer alone. When survival becomes fragile, trust isn't asked for, it's offered, silently, between breaths. The morning after the storm did not bring warmth. It brought stillness. Cold stillness. The kind of silence that makes you afraid to move, in case the frost shatters around you. Jonas awoke stiff, his back locked in angles shaped by snow and worry. His breath fogged in front of him, catching the faint sunlight filtering through the cracks in the old tarp. His first motion wasn't to stand, or stretch, or groan. It was to turn. To look. Shadowlight was awake. Truly awake. The horse wasn't just alive, he was aware. Eyes wide, ears turning toward sounds, nostrils twitching. He still lay down, his body weak, but the soul inside him had returned. And that made Jonas sit straighter than any fire ever could. He reached out, tentative. His hand touched the shoulder of the horse. No flinch. Something passed between them. Jonas couldn't name it, but he knew it. Shadowlight blinked. Jonas exhaled. Beside them, Ember stirred. She licked her paw, bandaged and stiff, and let out a soft sigh. Her tail brushed the ground once. The storm had passed. Jonas got to work. He checked the bandages, changed them, cleaned the wound with melted snow. Ground up herbs he'd kept in a pouch so old he'd nearly forgotten it existed. He rubbed the balm into the wounds gently, whispering to the horse all the while. "You stayed," he said. "So I'll stay too." Shadowlight didn't respond. But he didn't look away. Ember ate dried meat in small bites. Jonas refilled her water bowl, melted snow, and a bit of jerky broth to keep her strength up. She drank, limping slightly when she walked but still alert. Jonas took stock of their supplies. Enough for 2 more days, maybe 3, if rationed. The sun came and went like a guest who didn't want to impose. Cloudy light brushed the snow outside, but the wind stayed calm. Jonas reinforced the shelter. Found more dry branches. Patched up a tear in the canvas. He even found the old hand-crank radio he'd stashed there years ago. It didn't catch a signal, but the act of turning it on felt like lighting a flare in the void. That evening, he cooked mash with dried oats, herbs, and a few wild berries. Shadowlight sniffed it, then took 3 bites. Then 4. It wasn't much. But Jonas could have wept from relief. As the fire burned, Jonas sat with his back to the shelter wall. Ember's body rested against his thigh. Shadowlight lay quietly in the hay, occasionally flicking his tail. "Orion," Jonas said aloud, not for the first time. He would have hated this weather. "You remember?" He'd dig himself a bed in the snow and just sit there, like he owned the forest. No one answered. And yet, something in the silence felt full. Jonas tilted his head back, watching the smoke curl through the slit in the canvas. He thought of the vet's voice. Of the cold clinical hallway. Of the steel needle. He thought of the silence afterward. Now, he looked at the horse who should have died. And the dog who had followed him into hell. And the man who had given up once, but not again. That night, they slept, not out of defeat, but in fragile peace. The next morning came like breath drawn and slow. The air was clearer. The sky cracked open with hints of blue. Shadowlight stood up. Stood. Wobbly. Swaying. But upright. Jonas dropped the kettle he'd been holding. "You stubborn miracle," he whispered. Ember barked. Not softly. Not weakly. Barked. Jonas stepped forward, holding his breath like it might break the moment. Shadowlight looked at him, blinked once, then took a step. 1. 2. He wobbled and had to rest again. But he had stood. He had walked. Jonas sat beside him, his hand on the horse's mane. "No one else will believe this," he said. He didn't care. Outside, a raven called once. Far away. Distant. Life stirring again. Jonas leaned back against the wall, firelight playing on his cheeks. Ember curled beside him. Shadowlight lay his head gently on the hay. And deep in the forest, a new day began, not with noise, but with quiet survival. And trust earned, inch by inch, in the frost. Hope doesn't always roar. Sometimes it limps. Sometimes it falls. But it moves. It began with a breath, so soft Jonas almost mistook it for wind slipping through the cracks of the makeshift shelter. But no wind moved this way. This breath trembled. This breath fought. Shadowlight was standing. Not well. Not gracefully. But upright. Jonas blinked against the dim gray morning light and pushed himself upright on sore elbows. His body still ached from the ordeal of dragging the horse through the snowstorm, but that ache dissolved now into disbelief. Shadowlight's legs shook. One hind leg, wrapped tightly in the makeshift sling, was barely bearing weight. But the rest of him, alive, present. His head turned slightly at Jonas's movement. Their eyes met. Jonas didn't speak. He only breathed, just once, like a man who had nearly drowned and had broken the surface again. "Good boy," he finally murmured. Shadowlight's ears twitched. Across the shelter, Ember stirred. She lifted her head, snout coated in frost, and wagged her tail once. Her paw, still wrapped in bandages, twitched against the straw. Jonas stood slowly. Knees cracking. Shoulders burning. He didn't move toward the horse, he let Shadowlight take the moment. Let him own it. The Mustang trembled, then took one careful step. The sling held. The wounded leg didn't buckle. Another step. Jonas let out a laugh. Dry. Shaky. Real. "You're either a miracle or the most stubborn thing I've ever met." Shadowlight snorted, almost offended. Jonas dropped to his knees. The horse stopped in front of him. "I don't know why you picked me. But I'm not walking away this time." The next 2 hours were quiet work. Jonas fed Ember a mixture of jerky broth and oats. She ate without complaint. He boiled snow for water, rubbed salve into Shadowlight's flank, cleaned reopened cuts, and reset the sling with tighter knots. The horse flinched now and then, but allowed to care. Outside, the light sharpened. Snow glittered like cold fire. Trees stood still. But Jonas sensed the forest was only pretending to sleep. They needed to go. The plan wasn't perfect. It wasn't even good. But it was the only plan Jonas had. They would walk. Or limp. Or stumble. 3 miles through shifting snow, ice bridges, wind shears, and whatever watched from the trees. Jonas packed light, flint, a thermal blanket, dried berries, a blunt knife, and a map that was more memory than ink now. He tied an old parka around Shadowlight's shoulders, patched a second booty onto Ember's paw, and said a quiet prayer to the wind. "Let's get home." The first half-mile passed with brutal grace. Shadowlight moved slowly. Jonas walked beside him, one hand on the halter, the other on Ember's lead. They made progress, but not without pain. Jonas slipped twice. Once into a frozen creek bed that looked like solid ground. His shoulder hit rock. He didn't stop. Ember growled once at the shadows in the tree line. Jonas paused, hand tightening on his knife. Nothing moved. But the silence thickened. By noon, they reached a ridgeline of ice-coated stone. Jonas remembered this place. He had fallen here during a hunting trip years before. It was steep, narrow, and treacherous. No going around. Only over. He scouted first. Found traction with pine boughs. Laid them flat across slick stone. Then returned for the horse. "Trust me," he whispered. "One step at a time." Shadowlight stepped. Slipped. Recovered. Ember whined, nose pressed against Jonas's leg. Jonas climbed first. Then Shadowlight. Then Ember. The wind howled above. Trees cracked below. But they crossed. They rested beneath a stone overhang. Jonas built a fire using bark, resin, and luck. The smoke curled into the wind, carrying hope with it. Jonas sat beside Shadowlight, feeding him crushed berries and pine needles soaked in warm water. He rubbed Ember's shoulders. Spoke to the flames. "You're not just a horse. You're a bridge," he said, "between who I was and who I still want to be." No one answered. They didn't need to. In the third mile, the trees opened. Jonas saw it first. His cabin roof. A crooked chimney. The wind vane he never fixed. The old barn like a half-forgotten memory. He wanted to run. He wanted to fall. But he stayed still. Shadowlight stood beside him, breathing hard. "We're almost there," Jonas whispered. Then, behind them, a sound. Crunch. Snow under weight. Jonas spun. Knife drawn. Eyes. Golden. Watching. The predator was back. Jonas didn't blink. He stepped forward. "You had your chance," he said. "Not today." The creature, bear, cougar, spirit, he didn't care, held his gaze. Then vanished into the trees. Jonas turned back. And walked. The barn was cold. Dark. Empty. Until now. Jonas led Shadowlight inside. Laid straw. Rubbed warmth into his limbs. Gave Ember a blanket and his last bite of jerky. Then he sat. And laughed. Not out of joy. Out of breath. Out of war. Out of guilt. Out of the man he used to be. And into the man he had become. Jonas Harlow, once lost, once broken, was home. Because of a Mustang who refused to die. And a promise that had finally been kept. Some wounds don't live in the flesh. They live in the way people look at each other. Jonas hadn't slept in days. Shadowlight was recovering well. The horse was walking again, circling the stall slowly. Ember had started eating again. Jonas had resumed cutting hay, mending fences, patching the barn roof like winter had never clawed them open. But the wind didn't just carry the scent of snow. It carried the feeling of being watched. On the fourth night after they returned to the barn, Ember let out a low, uneasy howl. She didn't bark like she usually did, she simply stood, ears alert, eyes locked on the tree-line where a broken tree cast a shadow shaped like a man. Jonas stepped outside, flashlight in one hand, rubber bullet rifle in the other. Not to kill. Just to scare. But out there, it wasn't a wild animal. It was Jim Barnes, the hunter in the orange jacket, smoking beneath the "No trespassing" sign like it meant nothing. "Well, I'll be." "You actually survived," Jim said with a dry smirk, glancing toward the barn. "What do you want?" Jonas kept his voice steady. Jim shrugged, voice cold as frost. "Heard you saved a wild Mustang. One of those that should have been left to nature." Jonas clenched his fists. "He's alive because he earned it." Jim stepped closer. "He's drawing in the goats, you know. I've tracked them. You think you're smarter than instinct?" Silence. Just the wind and Ember's tense breathing. Jonas didn't answer. But he knew a line had been drawn that night. 3 days later, Jonas spotted military boot prints around the barn. Not his. Not from any usual guest. The kind left by men who know how to track and disappear. The next night, headlights from a Jeep lit up the cabin. Jonas ran out. But the vehicle was already gone. He wrote to the sanctuary to warn them, but the signal was too weak. He tried the old radio. Static. No response. As Ember barked violently into the night, Jonas noticed something. A smear of fresh blood on the barn's edge. Not shadow lights. Human. He checked the stall cam. Black screen. Someone had been there. Had gotten close to shadow light. Jonas set traps around the barn. Kept the lights on all night. Patrolled with Ember, round after round. He didn't sleep. Barely ate. But he didn't break. One night, in the middle of a rain so cold it sliced like knives, Jim showed up again at the barn door. "I'm not here to start trouble," he said. Jonas raised his rifle. "Stay away from Shadowlight. You even know what he's bringing here?" Jim growled. "A damn gray bear. I've tracked it too. It's been following the blood scent of that horse. It tore through Brent's dog. Shredded a fence at the southern ranch. And now it's watching. Because you kept live bait." Jonas didn't move. Jim pressed on. "We don't live in the age of fairy tales and hope. If something can't survive, you let it go. You know that already, don't you, Jonas? Orion proved that." The name hit like a fist to the chest. "Don't. You didn't stop the vet that day. You stood there. That was your choice. And now? Now you're doing it again. Saving a wild one? How long before you give up again, when it falls one more time?" Jim's voice wasn't loud, but every word landed like a stone to the throat. Jonas breathed hard. But this time, he didn't fall. "Orion died because I stayed silent. Shadowlight lives because I stood up. That night, the bear came. No roar. No screech. Just a massive black shadow brushing the outer edge of the stall. Ember howled, a sound deep and old, like the memory of wolves. Shadowlight didn't cower. He stood up on his own. For the first time, fully upright, hooves stamping the ground as if summoning the soul of his kind. Jonas raised his gun. Jim stepped behind him, this time with real bullets. "Shoot it," he said. "No. It'll kill us all. It's nature. But killing it won't prove a damn thing." Jonas walked toward the bear. No rifle. Just a flashlight. He shone the beam straight into its eyes. And then Ember leapt forward, howling loud and sharp like a sacred cry of the forest. The bear froze. It looked at Jonas. Looked at Ember. Then turned away. Just like that. The next morning, the shadow was gone. Jonas sat in the barn. Shadowlight rested his head in Jonas' hands. Ember lay in the sun. And somewhere in the forest, the wind passed over old tracks, carrying something older than instinct. Trust. And the choice to stand with the light. Some lives aren't meant to be told. Only to be lived and remembered. That year, the Bitterroot Woods were no longer a place people avoided. They had become somewhere people came to listen to the wind tell stories. Stories of a man who had once lost everything, and of a horse who refused to give up. Echo Haven, the name Jonas gave to the land he once ran away to, had now become a haven for children, biology students, writers, and artists alike. A place to learn how to live slowly again. There stood Shadowlight, the wild Mustang who had nearly died in the snow years ago. Older now. No longer as swift. But still proud, noble, bearing on his body the scars of survival. Beside him, Ember, now nearly 15, still lay with her head resting by the stall door. Her eyes were fading, but every time Jonas walked past, they still lit up with that same unwavering spark. Jonas stood before a circle of 7th graders, seated in a ring on the dry autumn grass. A red-headed boy stood and pointed at Shadowlight. "Mister, weren't you scared back then?" Jonas glanced toward the barn. Shadowlight raised his head. They locked eyes. Yes, Jonas said quietly. I was terrified. Then why didn't you just run away? Jonas crouched down and drew two figures in the dirt with a twig, one shaped like a horse, the other like a man, their lines intersecting, then breaking apart. Because if I'd run away, I wouldn't be myself anymore. There was a time I stayed still. I let a horse be taken away, just because people said hope was gone. But death isn't the scariest thing. Turning your back when you could have done something, that is. No one said a word. But the wind shifted. And an old horse stood, walked closer to the fence, as if to prove Jonas had spoken the truth. Orion, the horse he'd lost. Shadowlight, the one he saved. Every night, Jonas still held the same ritual. He would sit on the wooden chair he'd built himself, hand resting on a worn leather journal, the one where he'd once written all the words he couldn't say aloud. Every story Jonas told his visitors held some truth. But part of them were scars that had never really faded. Orion didn't die the day he fell, Jonas whispered into the dark. He died the day I couldn't say no. And you, Shadowlight, you lived the day I stepped into the snow. He looked up. No snow. No wind. Only starlight. Jonas hosted a small gathering on the exact anniversary of the day he met Shadowlight. No flyers. No banners. Just a round campfire, a few wooden stools, and one worn-out guitar. University students came. An old woman painted Shadowlight's eyes in watercolor. A boy played a haunting tune on the harmonica. And Jonas told everything. From that howling day when Ember led him to the first bloodstained snow. From that very first look, Shadowlight's eyes in the frost, as if to say, if you don't act, I won't survive. Jonas spoke. Without pause. Without trembling. Without tears. But when he finished, the forest held its breath. Ember didn't wake up. The old dog lay curled, head resting just at the threshold of the barn, the place she had guarded through countless winters. Jonas didn't cry. He sat beside her. Gently stroked her head. Shadowlight approached. Tapped his hoof on the ground 3 times. Jonas looked at him. Then nodded. Thank you, he whispered. You saved me more than I ever saved you. The following year, Jonas and the sanctuary built a new lodge for abandoned horses. Carved into the wooden entrance was a name. Ember's Path. Where the old guards still protect. Beneath the trees, Jonas taught children how to recognize the sound of hooves in the snow. How to read the wind. How to place a hand on the forehead of a creature that couldn't speak, but could listen with its heart. One late autumn afternoon, Jonas opened his leather journal. For the first time, he wrote a line, not about Orion. Not about Shadowlight. But about himself. I've become the man Orion would be proud of. And Shadowlight is my living witness. He closed the journal. Walked outside. The breeze was soft. And the shadow of an old horse still lingered across the grass. Some battles were never yours to fight. But if your heart knows what's right, don't wait for someone to hand you a sword. Sometimes, just not turning away makes you the hero of your own story. This isn't just a tale about a man and a wild horse. It's about facing your past, even when it's full of scars. About choosing compassion over indifference. And sometimes, it's about standing up simply because of a look. A look that sees something in you when no one else does. Because sometimes, saving a life is the only way to save your own. If you've ever lost your faith, hit the ground, or stood at the edge of letting go, remember, there's always a soul somewhere waiting for you to return. It might be a horse. Or it might be a piece of yourself that forgot how to breathe. This story doesn't end here. It continues, in forests untouched, in the wind whispering through tall pines, and in every heart still learning how to trust again. If something in this story stirred you, share it. Let the light of one rebirth illuminate another. Let someone out there know they're not alone. Like, share, and don't forget to subscribe to Gallop of Glory, where stories aren't just told, they're lived again in every beat of courage. And next time, when the wind calls, you'll hear it. Because now, you're ready to walk into the next chapter of a legend still being written.